The first thing to hit the floor wasn't a coffee cup, but a framed photograph. It didn't just fall, it was violently swatted through the air by the arm of a man whose authority had never once been questioned. The frame cracked against the floorboards, glass spiderwebbing across the smiling faces of Stella and her late mother. Then the rest of the cafe followed. A heavy, rusted bucket of soil and vibrant seaside blooms tipped sideways, spewing wet dirt and water across the entrance. The gentle hiss of the espresso machine was drowned out as a row of ceramic mugs and glass vases was swept off the counter, shattering in a discordant symphony of destruction. By the time Muyel turned around to leave, half the interior of Stella's sanctuary looked like a hurricane had ripped through it. And through all of it, Stella said nothing. She stood amidst the flying debris, her dark, tight curls framing a face wiped clean of panic. She didn't scream or drop to her knees, she just stood there in her simple V-neck sweater, raising a single hand in a quiet, defensive gesture, watching him with an expression that wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger, it was a profound, unyielding disappointment. And that heavy silence unnerved Muyel far more than any hysterical pleading ever could. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored suit and pushed through the door without looking back. Muyel had spent the better part of a decade wrapping the city's underworld around his finger. He didn't just run a syndicate, he engineered it with cold, calculated efficiency. He absorbed entire districts, independent docks, family-owned warehouses, small coastal plots that had belonged to the same locals for generations. All of it eventually vanished beneath the sprawling concrete footprint of his organization's territory. His lieutenants called him efficient, his rivals called him a monster. Nobody called him merciful. Stepping out of the suffocating scent of crushed petals and spilled espresso, Muyal drew a slow breath of the harsh, salted ocean air. His driver was already waiting at the curb, the engine of the sleek black sedan a low, predatory hum against the distant sound of crashing waves. As he sank into the plush leather of the back seat, he didn't spare a single glance at the quaint, weathered storefront he had just left in ruins. To look back was a sentimentality he had purged from his system a long time ago. 10 years. That was all it had taken for a nameless enforcer with bruised knuckles to gut the city's oldest crime syndicate from the inside out and rebuild it in his own image. The old bosses had ruled the streets with loud, chaotic violence and messy vendettas. Muyal had replaced them with real estate portfolios, zoning laws, and a cruelty so precise it felt like surgery. He didn't just want fear, he demanded absolute, frictionless order. Under his tenure, the underworld stopped being a loose collection of gangs and became an institution. Corrupt politicians were treated as shareholders, rival factions were treated as liquidated assets, and the city itself was simply a blueprint waiting for his red pen. His current masterpiece was the Marina Consolidation Project. It was a sprawling vision designed to transform the fractured, independent coastline into a monolithic commercial district entirely under his thumb. On paper, it was an urban revitalization miracle. In practice, it was a bloodless siege. For months, his organization had systematically choked the life out of the seaside block. Supply lines were subtly disrupted, city permits were mysteriously revoked, and small business owners were offered buyouts that were less a negotiation and more an ultimatum printed on heavy cardstock. One by one, the stubborn locals had folded, trading their generational history for survival. Except for her. Stella's Seaside Café was a geographical anomaly sitting dead center in Zone 4 of his development plans. It was a stubborn, jagged little puzzle piece, ruining the immaculate, sweeping lines of his empire. His lieutenants had tried financial pressure, they had tried quiet intimidation, yet week after week, his heavily leveraged contracts were returned unsigned, forcing Muyal to step out of his high-rise boardroom and descend into the grime of the streets to handle the eviction personally. As the sedan pulled away, leaving the shattered remnants of her livelihood behind, Muyal stared coldly out the tinted glass. The destruction of her shop wasn't an act of malice, he reasoned. It was simply the cost of doing business. The city was a massive, hungry machine, and it could not be halted by the fragile memories clinging to a dying flower shop. It was a matter of efficiency, and Muyal never let anything or anyone stand in the way of progress. The dust of the wreckage began to settle, dancing in the late afternoon sunbeams that cut through the salt-crusted windows. Stella didn't move for a long time. The silence that followed Muyal's departure was heavier than the noise of his destruction. Slowly, she looked down at the shattered remains of the photograph, the only one she had of her mother standing in front of this very counter 30 years ago. In the photo, her mother's smile was as warm as the coffee she served. Now that smile was bisected by a jagged crack in the glass. To Muyao, this place was a line item on a ledger, a stubborn obstacle to a visionary future. To Stella, it was the only place left in the world where her mother's ghost still breathed. The deep scratches on the floorboards were from her mother's favorite rocking chair. The faint, comforting scent of cinnamon that lingered beneath the copper pipes was the remnant of a recipe passed down through 3 generations of women who had survived winters and hardships on this coast. This café wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary of memory, a library of the lives that had passed through its doors long before the city was choked by steel and glass. The first contract had arrived 6 months ago. It had been delivered by a man who smelled of expensive cologne and artificial politeness. He had called the offer life-changing, laying out a figure that would have allowed Stella to move anywhere else in the country. Stella had read it, felt the cold weight of the numbers, and handed it back without a word. Then came the relentless phone calls, the inspections by mysterious city officials, and finally the visits from men whose silence was more threatening than any shout. "Everyone has a price, Stella," the last emissary had told her, his shadow stretching long across her clean floors. "Not everything is for sale," she had replied. Her voice hadn't trembled then, and it didn't tremble now as she reached down to pick up a shard of the broken frame. She had watched the neighborhood change from her window. She had seen the old baker across the street weep as he signed his shop away to a shell company. She had watched the docks get fenced off, replaced by steel skeletons and the cold, unblinking eyes of security cameras. She was the last holdout, the final piece of the old world refusing to be swallowed by the new. She knew who Muyao was. Everyone in the city knew the name spoken in fearful whispers. But she also knew that if she signed that paper, she would be erasing her mother's legacy a second time. She would rather stand in the ruins of her history than live comfortably in a future bought with blood money. As she gripped the broken photo, a single drop of blood welled from her thumb where the glass bit deep, staining the image of the shop. She didn't flinch. She simply began to sweep. The bell above the door chimed, a light, silver sound that felt like a sharp intrusion in the heavy afternoon heat. When Muyol stepped inside, the atmosphere of the café shifted instantly. It was a space that breathed with a delicate sensory beauty. The air was a soft tapestry of roasted Tanzanian beans, dried lavender, and the sharp, clean scent of the salt spray drifting in from the harbor. Sunlight pooled on the weathered oak tables, illuminating the fine dusting of flour on the counter where Stella had been preparing the morning's last batch of scones. It was a place built on the human scale, warm and vibrant, and Muyol's presence was a cold smudge of ink on a watercolor painting. He didn't look like a man who destroyed things. He looked like a man who owned the concept of time itself. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his movements slow and deliberate as he ran a gloved finger along the edge of a ceramic display. Stella stood behind the counter, her hands still dusted with white, watching him with that same unnerving, quiet gravity. She didn't offer him a menu. She didn't ask how she could help him. She simply waited for the inevitable. "It's a beautiful place, Stella," Muyal had, his voice a low, melodic friction. "But beauty is a fragile currency in this part of the city. He didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't need to. He took a single step toward the center of the room and gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the shadows following him. The violence that followed was not chaotic, it was surgical. With a casual, backhanded motion, Muyal swiped the framed photograph of Stella's mother off the shelf. The sound of the glass shattering was the signal. His men moved with a practiced, rhythmic cruelty. A heavy, galvanized bucket filled with potting soil and fresh lilies was kicked over, the dark earth blooming across the floor like a spreading bruise. The espresso machine, the heart of the shop, was struck with a crowbar, emitting a dying hiss of steam that clouded the air. Glass vases toppled in a slow-motion cascade, their water soaking into the petals of freshly cut peonies until the floor was a graveyard of drowned colors. Through the crashing of ceramic and the splintering of wood, Muyal never took his eyes off Stella. He wanted to see the moment she broke. He wanted to see the fear finally drown out that defiant light in her eyes. But as the last shelf was ripped from the wall, sending a shower of vintage mugs to the floor, Stella remained as still as a statue in the center of the ruins. The price of her defiance was laid out in the wreckage at her feet. Her income, her history, and her mother's legacy, all reduced to debris in less than 3 minutes. Muyal adjusted his cuffs, the silence returning like a suffocating shroud, and walked out into the sun, leaving the scent of jasmine to be replaced by the smell of cold, wet earth. The elevator ascended in a vacuum of silence, the brushed steel walls reflecting a man who looked exactly like the monster he was. But as the doors slid open to the private, high-security medical wing, Muyal began a subtle, practiced shedding of his skin. He stepped out of the elevator and into a world of hushed voices and filtered air, a place where his name didn't command terror but bought the most expensive silence money could provide. Before entering room 702, he paused at the sanitation station. He scrubbed his hands with a ferocity that bordered on ritualistic, as if he could wash away the lingering scent of damp earth and the memory of the shattered photograph. He removed his tailored charcoal jacket, draping it over a chair in the hallway, leaving behind the armor of the boss to become, for a brief moment, merely a son. Margaret lay in the center of the sterile, white room, looking impossibly small beneath the weight of the high-tech monitoring equipment. The successful organ transplant, carried out weeks ago by a team of surgeons who were paid never to ask where the funding came from, had returned a faint, healthy glow to her cheeks, but she still seemed like a piece of fine porcelain held together by hope and machinery. Muyal pulled a chair to the bedside, his movements devoid of their usual predatory grace. He reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused palm dwarfing her fragile fingers. This was the only person in the world who didn't look at him and see a blueprint for destruction. To her, he was still the boy who had promised to take her away from the cold, hungry nights of their past. She was the singular why behind every building he leveled and every rival he silenced. If the city had to burn to keep her heart beating, he would personally strike the match. "You're late," she whispered, her voice a papery rasp as her eyes fluttered open. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Business ran long," Muyal replied, his voice dropping an octave, losing its jagged edge. He leaned forward, tucking a stray lock of silver hair behind her ear with a tenderness that would have terrified his lieutenants. "The doctors say your recovery is a miracle, Mother. They've never seen a donor match this perfect. It's as if the universe finally owed us a debt." He sat with her in the expensive quiet, watching the rhythmic pulse of her vitals on the screen. In this room, he wasn't a visionary or a shark. He was a guardian, fierce and unyielding, protecting the only sanctuary he had ever known. He didn't know yet that the miracle he was celebrating had been bought with the very life he had spent the afternoon trying to extinguish. For now, there was only the steady beat of a borrowed heart,
and the cold, comforting weight of a promise kept.
The hum of the hospital's climate control was the only sound as Muyul stepped into the lead surgeon's private office. He had come to deliver a final, untraceable payment, a gesture of gratitude that the hospital board knew better than to refuse. The room was empty, the surgeon likely pulled away for an emergency, leaving a heavy mahogany desk cluttered with the remnants of a long shift. Muyul didn't like waiting. He paced the small space, his gaze instinctively scanning the room for any detail that didn't fit his sense of order. That was when he saw it. A thick, translucent folder labeled Donor Identity Confidential, resting atop a stack of post-operative reports. Usually, such files remained sealed, protected by a wall of legalities and professional ethics, but Muyul had never believed in walls he didn't own. With a practiced, clinical flick of his wrist, he flipped the cover open. He expected to see the medical history of a stranger, a nameless, faceless entity whose only purpose was to provide the biological miracle his mother required. Instead, a standard identification photo stared back at him, clipped to the upper corner of a residency permit. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. There were the dark, tight curls. There was the steady, unblinking gaze that had refused to flicker even as his men tore her world apart. There was the simple V-neck sweater she had been wearing only hours ago when he stood in the center of her café and ordered its destruction. Stella. His eyes scanned the fine print of the medical summary, his mind racing to process the staggering irony of the data. Blood type O negative, compatibility 99.8%. The dates aligned with surgical precision. While he had been sitting in his glass-walled boardroom mapping out the systematic erasure of her neighborhood, she had been lying on a sterile table in this very building, giving a piece of herself to a woman she didn't know. She hadn't asked for a payout. She hadn't used it as leverage to save her shop. She had simply signed the consent forms and walked back to her quiet seaside sanctuary, never breathing a word of her sacrifice, even as Muyul's boots crushed the glass of her mother's photograph into the floorboards. A cold, jarring sensation settled in his chest, a rare, unwelcome guest called guilt. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had adjusted his cuffs so calmly as he walked away from her ruins, and realized they were still faintly stained with the dust of her shattered life. The woman who had given his mother back her heartbeat was the same woman whose heart he had just tried to break. For the first time in a decade, the visionary of the city found himself standing in a darkness he couldn't control. The paper felt unnervingly light in his hand, yet the weight of the information written upon it threatened to crush the very air from his lungs. Muyul's eyes traced the timeline with the same cold precision he used to analyze a hostile takeover, but the numbers refused to remain mere data. They became a jagged, mocking indictment. February 14th. On that afternoon, Muyul had sat in a climate-controlled boardroom overlooking the harbor, his fountain pen hovering over a demolition order for Zone 4. He had signed his name with a steady hand, authorized the escalation of pressure against the final holdout, and moved on to the next item of business without a second thought. According to the file, at that exact hour, Stella had been wheeled into operating room 3. She had gone under the knife while his men were scouting her shop for weaknesses. She had spent hours in a drug-induced sleep, her body being open to provide the very life force that currently kept his mother's monitors humming in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The anonymous savior hadn't just matched his mother's blood, she had matched a need so profound it had bordered on the impossible. And she had done it for nothing. No stipend, no legal settlement, not even the standard reimbursement for lost wages. The door clicked open, and the lead surgeon stepped in, stopping short at the sight of the boss holding the confidential file. For a fleeting second, a flicker of professional alarm crossed the doctor's face, but it was quickly masked by the weary deference one showed a man of Muyul's standing. "Mr. Muyul, I didn't realize you were still here."
the surgeon said, his voice cautious. Muyol didn't look up from the photo of the girl in the V-neck sweater. The donor, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. She took no compensation? My accountant set up a fund for this. It was supposed to be settled. The surgeon sighed, leaning against the doorframe. She was adamant. She said she wasn't selling a part of herself, she was simply answering a call. She told us she had a legacy of kindness to uphold. Honestly, it was a miracle we found her. Most people in this city want a price for everything. She just wanted to go back to her café. A legacy of kindness. Muyol thought of the bucket of soil he had seen upended. He thought of the jasmine-scented air being choked by the dust of falling plaster. He had walked into her sanctuary like a god of ruin, demanding she sell her history, never realizing he was already a debtor to her blood. The city was indeed a machine, but for the first time, Muyol realized he had thrown a wrench in his own gears. He had spent the day trying to destroy the only person who had saved the one thing he loved. The debt wasn't just unpaid, it was unpayable.
The bell didn't chime this time. It lay in a tangled heap of brass and splintered wood near the threshold. When Muyol stepped back into the café, the twilight was bleeding through the shattered windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the wreckage. Stella was there, kneeling in the dirt, her hands red raw from picking up shards of her mother's past. She didn't look up when his polished shoes stopped inches from her workspace. He hadn't brought his men this time. He brought a leather briefcase and the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who realized he had miscalculated a variable he didn't even know existed: a soul. "I am here to rectify the events of this afternoon," he said. His voice was steady, but the efficiency he prided himself on felt like hollow armor. He reached into his coat and produced a check, the numbers written upon it enough to buy 10 such cafes, and a life of leisure in any city she chose. He set it on the one remaining section of the counter. Stella finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't red from weeping, they were clear, reflecting the ruins of her sanctuary. She didn't even glance at the paper. "Is this the price of my silence?" she asked, her voice a quiet friction. "Or the price of your conscience?" "It is a debt," Muyol replied, the word tasting like ash. He couldn't tell her about the hospital wing yet. To do so would be to admit a vulnerability he wasn't ready to yield. "The development plans for this zone have shifted. This is to ensure you can rebuild elsewhere, better, larger." "I don't want better, Muyol. I wanted my mother's shop. You took that." She stood up, brushing the soil from her knees with a dignity that made his millions look like counterfeit paper. She picked up the check, her fingers barely touching the ink, and handed it back. "You think everything can be resolved with a signature and a payout. You think you can break a person's soul and then send a bill for the repairs." "This is more than most see in a lifetime," he countered, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It was the only way he knew to move, to push until the world bent. "Then give it to someone who wants to be part of your world," Stella said. She turned back to her broom, the movement a dismissal more absolute than any locked door. "I won't be another asset on your ledger, not for any price." Muyol stood in the wreckage of the shop he had destroyed, holding a fortune that had suddenly become worthless. For the first time in his rise to power, he realized that some things, like mercy and like blood, simply couldn't be bought back. He looked at the shattered frame on the floor and realized that while he owned the city's skyline, he was currently the poorest man in the room. The boardroom on the 64th floor was a desert of glass and cold blue light. Outside, the city skyline that Muyol had spent a decade bending to his will stretched toward the horizon, a sprawling grid of ambition. But inside, the air was thick with the low, rhythmic grumble of the men who sat around the obsidian table, men who viewed the world as a series of obstacles to be paved over. The demolition of Zone 4 was scheduled for sunrise, Director Park said, his voice a dry rasp as he tapped a digital stylus against a tablet. The crews are on standby. The heavy machinery is already idling at the perimeter. We are 48 hours behind the milestone, Mayul. Every hour that café stands is a leak in our projected revenue. Mayul didn't look at the projections glowing on the wall. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the board, watching the distant, tiny flicker of the streetlights along the coast. He could almost smell the salt air, almost hear the sound of shattering glass from the afternoon before. The plans have changed, Mayul said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's tension like a blade. Scrap the blueprints for the central plaza. Redesign the commercial hub to curve around the existing structure at Lot 112. A stunned silence followed. Lot 112 was the heart of the zone. It was the broken machine he had ordered to be crushed. That's impossible, a younger executive stammered, leaning forward. The structural integrity of the entire north wing depends on that anchor point. To build around a crumbling coffee shop, it's inefficient. It's a blemish on the entire aesthetic of the project. The board won't approve a billion-dollar deviation for a sentimental holdout. Mayul turned slowly. The visionary light in his eyes had been replaced with something colder, something more ancient than corporate strategy. He walked to the head of the table, his shadow stretching long and dark over the digital maps. "I am not asking for approval," he said, his hands flat against the obsidian surface. "I am giving an order. If the architecture cannot accommodate the café, then find architects who can. If the board finds the deviation too costly, they can discuss the efficiency of their own severance packages." He looked at the men who called him relentless, realizing they had no idea what the word truly meant. To them, power was a bulldozer. To Mayul, power was now the ability to protect a single fragile square of earth in the middle of a desert of steel. He would fight his own empire to ensure that one small sanctuary remained untouched, not because it was profitable, but because it was the only way to live with the blood that already stained his hands. He was no longer just building a city, he was building a fortress around a debt he could never pay back.
The restoration of the café had been a silent, miraculous affair. Skilled workmen had arrived in the middle of the night, replacing the shattered glass and the splintered oak with materials that felt older and more soulful than the originals. By the time the dust settled, the shop stood as a defiant, beautiful anchor in a sea of rising steel. The bell above the door chimed, its silver ring clear and bright. Stella looked up from the counter, her hands paused over a fresh arrangement of white lilies. An older woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a soft wool coat that couldn't hide her fragile frame. Behind her, standing like a dark sentinel in the shadow of the morning sun, was Muyul. He didn't enter, he simply held the door, his gaze fixed on the floorboards he had once ordered to be stained with wreckage. "I've spent a lifetime looking for this place," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped toward the counter. She looked at the walls, the copper pipes, and finally at the new frame resting in the place of honor, the same photograph of Stella's mother, painstakingly restored by the city's finest archivists. Margaret's breath hitched. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the image of the woman with the warm, resilient smile. "I knew her," she said, her eyes welling with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. 30 years ago, when the winters were colder than the city is now, I was a girl with nothing but a hungry child and no roof over my head. Your mother, she didn't just give us bread, she gave us the coat off her back. She told me that no one should ever have to choose between their dignity and their survival." Stella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. She looked at Margaret, then passed her to Muyul, who remained perfectly still in the doorway. The man who had tried to pave over her life was the child who had been saved by her mother's hands. She used to say that kindness is a seed, that you plant it and walk away, never knowing whose life will be shaded by the tree years later. Margaret took Stella's hands in hers, hands that carried the same quiet strength as the woman in the photograph. She saved us when the world was trying to erase us, and now you've done the same for me." The circle had finally closed. Outside, the construction crews were redirecting the path of the future, bending the city's progress to accommodate a small, jasmine-scented sanctuary. Muyol watched them from the threshold, the cold architect of the underworld finally understanding that he hadn't built his empire with stone and glass, but on a foundation of mercy he had never even seen. Kindness, he realized, always comes back around, sometimes as a heartbeat, sometimes as a second chance, and always as a debt that can only be paid by letting the light stay in. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes redemption and the hidden threads that bind us, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. The world can be a cold place, but as Muyel learned, a single act of mercy can change the blueprint of an entire life. We love hearing from our global community. Drop a comment below and let us know which city or country you are watching from. Thank you for being part of the story. We'll see you in the next one.